Hey everybody, Coldon here with another VOX Immortalis commentary guide. This video is for Heroic Madness of Deathwing, and this is Dragon Soul, and of course 10-man. So as you can see from this video being released, we finally did. We got Heroic Madness down, and it feels great. And of course this brings about the end of our Cataclysm raiding experience, having finished everything available to us. I think everyone's really proud. Unfortunately, personally I didn't find the last few bosses, basically Deathwing bosses, to be all that interesting or challenging. So hopefully in Mists of Pandaria there's a little more interesting dynamic content for the final bosses of the tiers. But at any rate, it's still fairly challenging, as you'll see, and was a difficult enough fight to warrant being near the end, I suppose. So for this video, we'll go over the overall strategy for the platforms, which you'll deal with 4 of them just like a normal. And I'm going to use the red platform because that's sort of the generic method. There's a little alteration in the others. And then I'll go back through and talk about specifics on the platforms themselves, as well as the final phase. The good news about this fight is that it's very repetitive. So once you get the basics down, how you handle one platform really doesn't change a whole lot between the next one. So let's go ahead and get started and take a look at the red platform all the way through. Alright, so before I get into the sort of generic strategy on each platform, let's talk a little bit about raid composition and class choices. So luckily, unlike Spine of Deathwing, this fight is not nearly as stringent in terms of what is required of your raid makeup. You can get away with a lot more generic raids and be successful. So that's good. That said, if you have access to it, there are things that'll help you quite a bit, especially when learning. So probably the biggest factor is having a strong tank, specifically a Death Knight. If you want to do a one-tank strategy, which is very common in this fight to meet the DPS requirements, Death Knight is all but required. You can probably do it with other tanks, with a lot of outside cooldowns and using taunts in the last phase and that kind of thing. But because Death Knights can use Blood Shield to mitigate a huge amount of Impale damage for most of the platforms, and because they can use AMS to get rid of stacks in the final part of the fight, it's very strong if you have a Death Knight. Other than that, you also want a form of 70% snare or slow if possible. And to my knowledge, I think only rogues can do this with Fan of Knives spamming in terms of actually keeping up constantly. A few other classes can do 70% snares, but not on demand, really. This is for the final phase, slowing the adds, which I'll talk about when we get there. So that helps a lot. You can do it without, but it's very helpful if you have it. And then finally, if you're using a one-tank strategy, you'll want some sort of class that can mitigate near one-shot damage on regular cooldown and survive it. So Shadow Priests are good for this. Rogues, again, are good for this. You could probably even use like a Fire Mage, something like that. But essentially, someone that can soak up an Impale instead of a tank. And this is, again, for one-tank strategies. So I'll talk about all these things and how they work in a little bit. Other than that, it's not too important what your raid makeup is, except you want strong AE DPS, specifically for the final phase. You have to deal with this new add type, which are these bloods that spawn. You have a very short period of time in which to kill them. So you want classes that have strong AE DPS, and specifically strong AE that procs Spellweave. We found through experimentation that there are some AE spells that, for no explicable reason, just simply don't proc Spellweave very often. So for example, our Warlock, he would Hellfire as Demonology spec, and it just does not proc Spellweave all that often for some reason. But as soon as you start using Rain of Fire as a Warlock, Spellweave goes off all the time. And we can't explain why exactly. But so certain spells just proc it more frequently, and you should try to figure out which ones, for your DPS especially, will do that. So as a Druid, for example, Mushrooms, I know as Balancer Healer, proc Spellweave like crazy. Just every hit practically is procs it on everything else and that kind of thing. So figure out what you have and utilize those. In terms of tanking or healing, if you're 2-tanking, pretty much any 2 tanks will be fine. But if you have access to it, a normal tank plus a feral druid, that's basically a cat DPS most of the fight, is very strong. And we've tried that quite a bit with pretty good success. And then in terms of healing, pretty much anything will do. I would suggest that Shaman healers are very strong for this fight because of the mechanics of the cataclysm debuff. And they can get back huge amounts of mana in a very short period of time after every platform. So they can spec for pure throughput rather than worrying about regeneration or anything like that. But really, anyone can heal this pretty well, I think. So, in terms of our raid, you'll see in this video we went for 1 tank, a Death Knight, a Shadow Priest off tank for the other Impales, and then we're using 2 healers, myself as a Druid and our Paladin. And as I said, we tried many different strategies, including 1 tank 3 heals and 2 tanks 3 heals. But in the end, this just seemed better primarily for the final phase, and I'll talk about that when we get there a little bit. So, anyway, that's the makeup stuff. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the mechanics of each platform and how they kind of go in this pattern that you'll get used to pretty quickly. So as we're about to loop back through this generic red platform, I'll talk a little bit about positioning of the raid and mitigating damage taken. So probably the most important factor, in my opinion, to learning this fight that you should focus on is positioning to deal with the crush effect cast by the mutated corruption. Just like in normal, this is cast on a random raid member, and it's cast in a straight line from the corruption's position out toward its target, hitting anyone from the corruption and beyond in that straight line. But it's a very thin line. So, unlike a normal where you can kind of ignore it, if multiple people are getting hit by crush every time, this is a lot of damage, and it's a lot more difficult to heal with other effects happening. So, you should try to position yourselves in some sort of spread out semicircle like we're doing here, so that any given target is not in a straight line with anyone else. So you can see to my right or my left, when our balanced druid got hit there just a second ago, the paladin on his left or her left did not get hit, and likewise I did not get hit either. So any sort of semicircle position like this with everyone spread out, you can be pretty close together, 5 or 6 yards even, is completely safe, and only one person should get hit by crush pretty much every cast. If you can do that, then healing on most of these platforms will be a lot easier to deal with. The next effect I'll talk about is the Corrupting Parasite. This is a new ability on Heroic, and you can see it's being cast on our Priest right now. So this is cast twice per platform, and it's on a random raid member. I don't think the tank can get targeted by it. And this has a 10-second debuff and dot, and it ticks for increasing damage over time, so the last few ticks hit really hard. Your healers should be very aware of who is being targeted and spam heals on that player, especially when they're getting about half duration left. When the corruption expires after 10 seconds, or when that player dies if they die early, which obviously you don't want, in either case, a new mob will spawn at their location called the Corrupting Parasite. And this is just a rooted mob that just sits there and immediately will start to cast an AE effect. However, when it spawns, it also does an AE around it within about 10-yard radius that does about 250,000 damage, fire damage. So it's important when the buff is about to expire that that player has a designated location in which they can stand that is not near anyone else, so that that 10-yard radius is not going to hit someone. Anyway, once the parasite spawns, it starts its 10-second cast, and if it finishes the cast, if it's still alive when the cast completes, it will do an AE that hits everyone in the raid for damage equal to its remaining health at that point. Now, it doesn't spawn with very much health, but a full health explosion, if it finishes at 10-second cast and you haven't done any damage to it, will probably kill you if you don't have major cooldowns of some sort. However, you don't necessarily have to kill it completely. You can get it low enough health that its explosion is safe. And again, this sort of leads into another main mechanic that you want to focus on throughout the fight, which sort of goes without saying, but that's maximizing your damage output. So when you have this parasite and it's doing its 10-second cast, if you get it to 30% and you're safe for the explosion to hit at that point, DPS should stop attacking it. You don't have to kill it because you're just wasting damage. It's going to die and kill itself anyway. If you find that you still need more time after the 10-second cast, it's not enough, you can have the player with the parasite stand in the time swirl area on the platform, and the parasite's cast time will be increased by 50% to 15 seconds before the explosion occurs. So this is a way, especially if you have a lot of ranged DPS or you don't want melee DPS to attack it, to give yourself a little extra time without being in danger. In our case, we had 3 melee DPS, so they kind of had to help attack it, so it was better to position it elsewhere. Anyway, so for our purposes, since we want to maximize all damage output to primary targets at all times, this really comes down to 2 main things: maximizing your AE damage, maximizing your spellweave damage. And a lot of the times you do the same. So you really have 2 main targets on each platform: the mutated corruption in the back, which spawns early and should be your primary target whenever it's up, and then the wing or the arm tentacle, of course, which triggers the next phase. To increase your spellweave and AE damage on these targets, you should place parasites near one or the other at all times, depending on what you're primarily focusing on at that time. So for almost every platform, our general rule is that the first parasite goes into the melee position near the corruption, so in the back. And because we're doing a semicircle position to avoid crush damage, we have enough room between us and the corruption that the parasite player can stand right next to the corruption, and that AE effect, when it explodes, doesn't hit anyone else. And then this way, as soon as it explodes and spawns, melee can step forward a few yards and be attacking the parasite, and simultaneously, any spellweave procs while attacking the parasite will hit the corruption because it's in melee range of it. So there we spawned our parasite right in melee range, and while killing it down, now spellweave procs are hitting the corruption, and this is just a little bit of extra damage that will add up over time, especially over 4 platforms. So I highly recommend you take advantage of this sort of thing. And depending on how you do things, you could spawn it, near the back, the wing corruption or something like that. Or excuse me, near the wing or arm tentacle, but you want to utilize spellweave whenever you can. So from there, we also have hemorrhage, which, I should mention the bolt actually. Bolt is just like it is on normal. You just have to kill it before it explodes, with the exception of the blue platform, which I'll talk about when we get there. Pretty simple. And then you have hemorrhage, which occurs much earlier in the phase than it does in normal, so your tank needs to be ready, especially if you're one tanking. Once the bloods spawn, in our strategy here, we do not kill them right away. And this is again to maximize damage. So we wait for the second parasite to spawn, which it just did on our priest. We place it right next to the wing or arm tentacle usually, because we're done with the corruption in the back. And then once the parasite appears, our tank moves all the bloods onto it. And this is also in melee range of the wing or the arm. So now AE damage on the bloods also hits the parasite, which also hits the wing or the arm. And again, these are just proccing off of each other, extra spell weaves, all that good stuff. So parasite position and blood position is very important. One thing I would suggest is make sure your DPS are not AEing on the bloods if no one else in the raid is doing it, or if most people aren't doing it. You should only attack bloods when you know you're going to AE them and you know you're going to kill them. Otherwise, it's wasted damage. You should be focusing on a corruption or a wing or arm. Anyway, so let's go back through this one more time here and go over the last few points on the general platform methods. So the last thing I want to talk about is how to deal with Impale, which is another vitally important aspect of this fight on Heroic. So depending on your raid makeup, you'll handle this a little bit differently. If you have 2 tanks, there's pretty much no rhyme or reason to it. You just have to plan for 2 Impales per platform and then figure out your cooldown rotations appropriately. You do need quite a few cooldowns depending on your class, so just be aware of that. Especially, I would suggest the yellow platform, the third one, is probably the most dangerous because of the timing of everything. So essentially the way it works is you have Dream for the first platform, so free 50% cooldown for your tanks. Then you use your normal big cooldown, your 50% cooldown on the red platform, the second one. But then it's not available again on the yellow one, the third platform. So you need outside cooldowns or your secondary cooldowns to survive it. Again, Death Knights with Blood Shields are very good at this. But if you don't have that, you'll need to use a lot of outside cooldowns. So when I was doing this as Feral, sort of off-tanking, I had to use 2 priest cooldowns outside as well as my own bark skin and hit point gain to survive. Anyway, and then by the time you get to the blue or fourth platform, your 50% tank cooldowns are up again, and you're fine. That said, if you are using a one tank strategy, which we are here, then you need to sort of gimmick this mechanic by having a particular player targeted with the next Impale as it's about to become off cooldown. So to do that, I mentioned before, certain classes need to have near full reductions on these effects because Impale does insane amount of damage. Its base damage is about 1 million damage. It's not mitigated by armor, and it's not lowered by the stacking raid debuff that's going out, 10-15% stuff. Neither of those affect damage, but everything else that lowers your damage taken or your physical damage taken will lower the damage of Impale. So, in our case, we're using a Shadow Priest, and he's using Dispersion, so that when the Impale hits him, he doesn't take hardly any damage, and it's fine. However, he doesn't have Threat, and to force him to get Impale, there's 2 things you have to do. The first thing is when Impale's about to be cast, the player that you want Impale on has to be the closest player to the corruption at the time of the cast, time of the cooldown. The second thing is that that player cannot be in melee range unless they're actually soaking melee hits somehow, or else they'll get smacked. So, in our case, what we do, and you'll see here in a second, is everyone in the raid backs up so that our Shadow Priest is the closest player to the corruption. And you can see his general position is sort of to the inside edge of the platform. You can kind of see him in the top left of the screen there. So that when everyone backs up and moves towards the wing or the arm, he's guaranteed to be the closest thing to the corruption. And you can, of course, put him on the opposite side here to my right, or move everyone else the other way. But either way, you want to make sure he's the closest thing. So we're all running out right now. This is around the time that the bolt comes out as well. And now everyone is out of melee range, and our Shadow Priest is the closest target to the corruption. So you just saw the message there, Impale on Dougal, which is our Shadow Priest. And the cast goes off, he disperses it, and then the tank runs back in, and everyone proceeds. So again, other classes can do this. Rogues have done this as well. Probably Fire Mages, I imagine. Pretty much anything that can survive the hit. I don't think you can use immunities on Heroic like you can on normal. So like cannon protection, things like that. So if you can, I highly suggest a one tank method. It's better for your DPS overall, and you can usually squeeze out an extra DPS or an extra healer. But again, if you have access, Feral Druid, that's basically full-time DPS, can pretty much soak the second Impale every time, and it's not a big deal for the most part. So, that is all the general stuff that you're going to deal with on each of the platforms here. And then let's go ahead and go back through, and I'll talk about specifics of each one and how they sort of change a little bit throughout, but they're not that big of a deal except for maybe the blue platform. So let's go through the platforms themselves in order, and I'll go ahead and talk a little bit about what we're doing in each, kind of walk through the fight and the subtle differences between each platform, even though overall they're pretty much the same every time, which leads to kind of a boring fight, unfortunately, and a little bit too long in my opinion, but there you go. So the green platform is generally the first one. Pretty much without exception, you should do this platform first. And that's just because the buff is kind of the weakest in terms of what it gives your raid. But you see we spread out in our semicircle positions pretty much so that we mitigate the crush damage overlapping. We move the parasite target off to a safe location away from other people. And when parasite is when it spawns, and then after its 10-second cast, when it's about to explode, we have everyone in the raid use Dream at the same time. And this offers a 50% mitigation, of course, to the damage from the explosion. And this means that we can save DPS and focus it on, again, primary targets. In this case, the corruption. So that first parasite spawns, we ignore it, we use Dream, and we keep DPSing the corruption in the back. When the second parasite spawns, just like we would do normally, we'll move it up front to the side, so it's near the wing or the arm. And again, this is to help AE damage. And then we'll move the bloods on top of it. We'll AE everything down, and this will hit the wing and the arm at the same time. Now, unfortunately, we had some communication problems. We didn't have the bloods over there in time, so we kind of missed some of our AE, and it's kind of a mess here. But generally speaking, as you'll see later on, the bloods will die at the same time that the parasite dies or is low. And if this second parasite on green is still alive and its cast time is about to finish, again, you'll have Dream available, so you should use Dream when it explodes and you'll be fine. Other than that, it's just like any other platform. So you'll still have to run out for the Impale if you're using a one-tank method like we are here, and kill the bolt before it lands, and kill the bloods off. And I should mention, if you get one blood left over in some situation, say your DPS doesn't quite AE everything or whatever, you should not focus on the blood. It's kind of wasted DPS, especially if it heals, of course. This is because the wing or the arm is generally going to be lower health, and therefore its damage is dealing to the raid is increasing as its health goes down. So you want to focus your damage and your time spent killing that wing or the arm. And then when you're safely on the next platform, like we just were, then you can kill off that solo blood, because it's only attacking your tank and it's not dangerous to you in any way. Anyway, so we're on to red. And red is very much like green. The only difference is that you don't have the Dream buff to use. So you will need to do some damage to the parasite, if not kill it outright. And how you do this is, again, up to your raid makeup a little bit. You don't want to kill it if you don't need to, because you want to focus more DPS where it's necessary. But it doesn't actually hurt you that much. You should kill it just to be safe. So in our case, on the red, we have our melee DPS pretty much focus on the parasite. And usually they kill it off without too much trouble. And so we're running out for the second Impale, which hits our Shadow Priests. He dispersions. Once he starts to get that 4-second cast, everyone runs back in. I should mention, in all cases, if you're using a one-tank method, it's important that your actual tank is the last player to run out of melee range and the first player to run back in after it's safe. This is because you obviously don't want anyone else to accidentally get meleeed from a white hit of the corruption while you're moving in and out. I should also mention that if no one is in melee range, corruptions that aren't casting Impale, meaning if the Impale is not quite on cooldown yet or ready to be cast, or if it was just cast, they will instead cast Impale Aspect on the aspect of that platform. And this is basically a way to ensure that you always have someone tanking most of the fight on the corruption. If 4 Impale Aspects are allowed to cast, it will kill the aspect and kill the raid, basically. So that's bad. So you have to get your tank back in pretty quickly, essentially. Other than that, red is just like green again, so we're moving the second parasite to the front, in this case the front right, near the wing or the arm, AE it with the bloods, and then burn the final wing down. So yellow is probably where things actually get interesting, I would say. The first thing you have to decide is how you want to handle attacking when you get over here, because the arm probably took damage as you crossed over to go to red, and you have a lot of time since you're over here really early before the corruption appears. So if you full DPS, you can burn it really low, which you see here, basically 80%. So you need to be careful, because getting any wing or arm below 90% will start its AE ticks on the raid, and these, of course, continue throughout the platform. So it's kind of a trade-off. If you are trying to maximize your DPS, you'll want to attack it right away and keep attacking it full on, like we do here. And then you'll have to heal through the damage that it adds from the ticks, which we do fairly well, but we do actually let one of our shamans die, so not the greatest. That said, if you're trying to increase your survival and your DPS is not as important, you probably want to not really attack the wing or the arm when you get over here so that it stays above 90% throughout the platform while you're killing the corruption and all that stuff. And then once the corruption is dead and the bloods are taken care of and parasites and all that good stuff, then you can start attacking the arm or the wing and kill it off. And the reason for this is if you get it to 70% too early as well, it will spawn blisterings. So that's the other change we do here. You'll see we have the regenerative bloods in the back this time rather than moving them forward by the wing or the arm along with the parasite. The reason for this is because we know the arm is very low. You can see it's at 72, 71%. And we didn't want it to be pushed over 70% from the AE on the parasites and the bloods. So we keep the bloods in the back and we AE them immediately if the arm is low. And that way our AE does not push it over 70% and spawn blistering tentacles too early. So once the AE is done, then we kill the parasite up front. About that time it's dying or about to die, we'll be pushing the arm tentacle above or below 70, spawning blisterings, and then we have to single target blisterings down just like you would on normal because you don't have the buff from Alexstrasza anymore. So again, at 40%, you'll get a second set of blisterings. Once again, you should single target them down. You can technically ignore these like you probably see on LFR, but because you only have 20% haste for the most part, it can be troublesome to heal through it, depending on what you've got in your raid. If you have 3 healers, you can probably do it, but it's kind of risky depending on how you want to handle it. So anyway, we decided to kill off both blistering sets on that platform, and this brings us to the final blue platform. Now, onto the final blue platform. Much like yellow, this is very challenging and obviously the hardest platform because you lost another buff. You should also be aware of mana. You can see both myself and our Paladin are using our cooldowns here because it kind of becomes an issue at this point, especially if you have 2 healers. But essentially, things are just like they are in yellow, except without the yellow buff for the bolt is going to hit, and it's going to do a lot of damage. Also, without the haste, your DPS will be quite a bit lower. So you may find that you're running up against that 3rd Impale timer, and if not that, also possibly the finish of the cataclysm when you're attacking the wing or the arm there. So you need to be really aware of maximizing your DPS on everything. Getting this corruption down as quickly as possible is very important because that 3rd Impale could be deadly depending on what cooldowns you have available. When the bolt's about to hit, you can see everyone's running out, and of course we're running far away so that the bolt damage is lessened on the impact, and then try to burn it down as quickly as possible. We use a lot of cooldowns to survive that. So even like our balanced Druid is tranking, I use Tree Form, our Paladin's using AM, 4-piece tank bonuses if you have them up, all that good stuff. Other than that, once the bolt is coming down, Impale is also hitting, the 2nd Impale. So if you're using a 1-tank strategy like we are, you can actually use your cooldown like Dispersion to cross over both the Impale and the bolt hitting. You have to just time it really well, and our priest does a great job of that. At that point, the corruption should be low or about to die, so you want to drop the 2nd parasite on top of the corruption in that case. Usually it will still be alive at that point, so drop the parasite up front, just like you did with the first one, and then AE the bloods on top of the parasite, and that will also AE the corruption in the back. So that's the one difference between the other platforms on this one in terms of the 2nd parasite. And then you'll go onto the wing. At this point, the wing should just be getting down to 70%. So you kill the blisterings off just like normal. And then at this point, you have a decision to make. We decide Since we lust right away, we can lust twice in this fight. So we lust when the first corruption on the green platform starts. We actually can lust again on the end of this platform. And we do this to increase DPS, of course, but also to increase healing and allow us to ignore those final set of blisterings on that platform. And you've seen this in LFR probably, as I mentioned, but it allows us to just gain a little bit of extra time to beat the Berserk. So let's go ahead and move on to the final phase, and I'll loop through this and talk about what we're doing here. So here we are finally entering the last phase, and this is, again, Deathwing at 20%, just like in normal. As you might imagine, this phase is really the culmination of the entire fight, and unfortunately, one of the flaws, I would say, in the design of this fight is that you have to do all this repetitive stuff for 10 or 12 minutes, basically 12, to get to this point just to actually practice this phase, and it's definitely one of the hardest parts of the fight. So that can be a little problematic. That said, everything really revolves around how much time you have on your Berserk timer when you reach this part of the fight. So if you get here with, say, 4.5 minutes or longer, you can really take your time, be very safe how you handle this phase, and you probably won't have much trouble if you have enough DPS. That said, if you have 3.5 minutes or under, you're going to really have to push it, meaning you're going to have to skip over a couple phases in some way, a couple, spawns, and I'll talk about how you do that in a second here. So again, this all goes back to maximizing your DPS throughout the entire fight on the primary targets that will push the fight forward to the next platform, to the next phase, and so on. And every little change you make will probably in some way be to impact that time left on your Berserk when you finally get here. And of course, practice obviously will make a big difference as well. So, the fight is much like normal, the phase is like normal in that you get fragments early on that cast shrapnel. You have to use Dream when there's a couple seconds left on shrapnel if it hits you. You want to kill the tears right away. I mentioned Death Knight tanks are really good on tears because they can get rid of the stacks most of the time with AMS. So make sure you use that. And then the new addition to Heroic is a new type of ad called Congealing Blood. And this spawns every 5% of Deathwing's health at 15, 10, and 5% health. And when these appear, they will spawn in a random location of 1 of 4 spots, which are indicated by the raid markers on the ground there. They will immediately start to walk toward or slime their way toward Deathwing's head. And if they reach him, they'll heal him for 1% of his health per slime that reaches him. They cannot be stunned, but they can be slowed. And any effect that snares will work. So if you have basically a rogue with Phantom Knives and a 70% snare that they can do over and over, that's really strong. Like Hunter Traps are good, but I don't think they can get 70%. I'm pretty sure they can't. Anyway, so the difference between a 50% that most classes have and a 70% is night and day. And if you can use consistent 70% snares, it will help this phase immensely. That said, it's of course doable without it. So you'll kind of see how we're doing that here. Essentially, when the phase begins, you'll attack Deathwing a little bit. You'll get ads pretty quick, so you don't have to worry too much if you attack Deathwing right off the bat. And switch to fragments immediately, just like normal. You want to kill these quickly so that any individual fragment can only cast 1 shrapnel before it's dead. That way you don't accidentally get 2 shrapnel casts on a particular player. You can see shrapnel is very dangerous even with Dream, so make sure players are topped off if at all possible. What else? So once the fragments are dead, you've got tears that are spawning. And you can see what we're doing here is getting Deathwing about 16%, so that when the tears are up and actively tanked, we're pushing Deathwing over that 15% marker and spawning the first bloods. So in this case, the bloods are spawning in the back left at the blue marker. So we drag the tears over them. We do AE snares and burn them down. Now that seemed pretty simple, and there's 2 reasons for that. One is that they spawn in the blue which is actually the furthest location that they can spawn from Deathwing's head, so you have the most time. And also because we specifically designed this raid makeup for maximizing DPS, for getting through this final phase, because this was the problem area that we were having. So using 1 tank and 2 healers means you have a lot of DPS, and if you have any AE classes at all, they should really be able to plow through those bloods. So with the tears and the bloods up at the same time, we AE them all down, and then we push Deathwing past 10%, get a second set of bloods, and once you kill those bloods, then you'll wait for the next fragment set. So we've got fragments here. We're killing those and waiting, not attacking Deathwing. Once the terrors spawn, we'll kill the bloods, or the terrors. At this point, we basically skipped an entire ad phase because we killed 2 blood sets between ad sets. And this is the way to do it if you're, at 4 minutes or under in terms of berserk time left. You have to do something like this. So once these terrors are dead, we're going to go back on Deathwing. And as you can see, the damage on the raid is really high at this point. So we're just trying to hang on. And once he pushes that 5% marker, we kill the bloods there. We have plenty of time to kill them. We just have to survive. So everyone should use Dream. Use all your raid and heal cooldowns. And just push him over the edge after the bloods are dead. He dies at like 1.5 or 2%. So that's Heroic Deathwing. It's crazy. Good luck, and thanks for watching. Burn Deathwing. Ignore everything. Personal cooldowns, survival. Hellstone.
Bitch.
Fuck yes!
There you go.
Wow.
It hurt. My hands are shaking.
That was scary.
Beautifully done.
Nice jump, guys. That was awesome.
Congratulations.
Congrats, you
Here's the
guys.
mailbox.